Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Noel, for arranging this event today. My first experience of Aden took place almost 20 years ago, and I think it has a relevance to some of the things that Noel just mentioned, particularly the idea of nostalgia. I was walking near Steamer Point, and there's a rather shabby parade of shops. And out of the shops, I heard the strains of the old BBC World Service tune Lily Bolero. And I was quite fascinated by this. And I went into this shop, and it was a rather dingy establishment. And there was an old Indian shopkeeper. And I got talking to him, and I looked at his wares, so to speak. And he had several sort of fly-blown paperback copies, which he told me he used to sell to British troops and sailors who were stationed in Aden in the 1960s. And he looked at me and he said, "You know, what the best thing the British ever did?" And I said, "No." He said, "They left Aden." I said, "Okay." And then he said, "Do you know what the worst thing they ever did?" I said, "No." He said, "They never came back." But on the 29th of November 1967, it was to the strains of the band playing, or the Royal Marines playing Things Ain't What They Used to Be, that the Labour government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson effected a total withdrawal from the Federation of South Arabia. Now, the British decision to abandon the Federation has been regarded as the inevitable outcome of the contradictions inherent in London's policy towards South Arabia from the outset. With their loyalty to London, so often a transitory commodity, attempts to cohere the disparate tribal groupings of the protectorates into a collective whole, with the foundation of the Federation of Arab Emirates in the south in February of 1959, and 4 years later, the Federation itself that now encompassed what had been Aden Colony, it was argued, were all doomed to fail. After all, the local politicians in Aden resisted the idea that their monopoly of power, prestige, and influence should be diluted by tribal sheikhs, emirs, or sharifs, considered to be the very antithesis of progression and modernity. And when allied to the growing influence of Arab nationalism throughout the Middle East in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the scene was set for a sustained program of subversion and revolt against British rule, supported both materially and ideologically by President Nasser of Egypt. Thus, within a decade of the 1957 Defence White Paper, which identified Aden as the linchpin of British power projection east of Suez, Britain abandoned its Aden base, bringing to a close a presence in the region that had lasted for 134 years. John Barrett Kelly, J.B. Kelly, most famously remarked at this period, "Britain betrayed her trust and ran away from her responsibilities in South Arabia. Faced with a terrorist movement," he meant by this the NLF, "which was determined, ruthless, and implacable, the British government displayed none of these qualities in return. In the contest of wills, it proved spineless." The question, of course, we will try to answer today is whether that is actually a fair summation. Now, I believe that there are 5 main factors that we need to consider in any analysis of why Britain did decide to abandon the Federation of South Arabia when it did, although the weight that should be attached to any one or all will undoubtedly inform the presentations and discussions here today. And I think these are as follows. Firstly, the failure of the colonial authorities in Aden to create a new collaborative local elite upon which to consolidate the Federation. Secondly, the intervention of outside powers that fueled indigenous unrest. Thirdly, the impact of new technological developments on British defence policy. Fourth, the emergent financial crisis that cast doubt on the continued wisdom of maintaining British bases east of Suez. And finally, the change in Britain's perception of her own image as a great power. Of these 5 elements, the first 2, I believe, occasioned Britain's departure from the Federation, while the other 3 certainly caused it. For those rulers and their followers who had thrown in their lot with the British, their sense of betrayal, for many, was profound. And as the old Arab adage had it, it's better to be the enemy of the British than their friend. If you are their friend, they will sell you, whereas if you are their enemy, at least they'll attempt to buy you. Now, several scholars have explored some or all of these factors from various standpoints. Carl P. Agostini, R.J. Gavin, Robert McNamara, Glenn Balfour Paul, Spencer Morby, and Joseph Costina have examined the malaise in policy-making in Whitehall amid competing tribal and religious affinities across South Arabia and Yemen in explaining the demise of the Federation. Professor Tore Petersen in Norway has argued that ideological antipathies across the parliamentary Labour Party towards what they regarded as an avowedly colonial construct rather than the pressures of the financial crisis is what really forced the British withdrawal from Aden. Other studies have been more damning towards the very idea that Britain could ever hope to shape the politics of South Arabia to suit its interests. The former BBC Middle East correspondent Roger Hardy is critical of the opportunities lost to engage with indigenous interlocutors. In his recent book exploring the legacy of both the British and French empires across the Middle East, Hardy pushes the argument that the failure by the authorities in London and Aden to engage with nationalist leaders in the late 1950s, such as the Sultan of Lahaj, the mercurial Sultan Ali Abdul Karim, as well as Muhammad Ali Jifri, leader of the South Arabia League, proved costly. Officials in Aden, including Sir William Luce and later Sir Kennedy Travakis, Uncle Ken to those who knew him well, preferred to ostracize such individuals who steered towards independence, threatened British economic and strategic interests in the region. And finally, in Arabia Without Sultans, the late Professor Fred Halliday emphasized the broader social and political tides that marked the British decline in South Arabia that sapped its power and willingness to defend those self-same interests. With a certitude born from an intrinsic belief in the logic of the Marxist dialectic, his book, which Halliday himself conceded in later life was very much a product of its time, saw the revolutionary forces that eventually triumphed across South Arabia as the harbinger of a new political order across the region devoid of anachronistic rulers. Even if one disagrees with the determinism of much of Halliday's book, his analysis captured much of what became the accepted narrative of Britain's withdrawal from South Arabia, a narrative that, to paraphrase the old Marxist dictum, sees British policymakers engaging in reactive choices and never amid the most propitious of circumstances. The dirty laundry of acrimony this produced, most notably between the Foreign Office and their counterparts in the Colonial Office, and indeed between the occupants of Great Smith Street, the old headquarters of the Colonial Office, and their subordinates in Government House in Aden, has been well aired in much of the literature mentioned, not least amongst the participants themselves. These bureaucratic battles, important as they are, remain only part of the story. Now, the actual area of Aden Colony was small, but beyond its boundaries, the protectorates, named precisely because of the veneer of protection offered by the British in Aden, extended over 112,000 square miles. Until the Second World War, the strategic threat to Aden was deemed insufficient to warrant anything more than the perfunctory visit of the occasional colonial officer from Aden. The protectorate rulers were left, by and large, to their own devices, exacting tribute from caravans that passed through their various fiefdoms, while investing little in return by way of infrastructure for the betterment of their subjects. It was only in the post-war period that economic developments, notably the construction of the BP oil refinery in Little Aden, coupled with the impact of migrant labour patterns on the political and social cohesion of Aden Colony, that finally spurred London to tackle the chronic state of economic underdevelopment. It now assumed, that is, the Aden Colony and the Aden base, a significance as great as anything experienced during the heady days of empire, as the need to realise Britain's energy assets in Iraq, Kuwait, and the trucial states of the Gulf linked Aden directly to the health of the British economy. Thus, the 1957 Defence White Paper declared that, and I quote, Britain must at all times be ready to defend Aden Colony and the protectorates and territories on the Persian Gulf for whose defence she is responsible. Up until the construction of that oil refinery, the British had co-opted a local elite comprising a mix of Arab, Asian, and European businessmen and merchants to run the affairs of the colony. Broad-based suffrage was unknown, and members of the Legislative Council, in effect, the government of the colony, were appointed by the British. These positions of privilege were undermined by the decision of the Colonial Office to forge ahead now with the creation of the Federation of the Arab Emirates of the South, which would come to encompass all but one of the states of the Western protectorates. Yet anxious to legitimise the British presence and strategic position in South Arabia, London apparently ignored the concerns of the governor of Aden, Sir William Luce, who argued that the establishment of a federal structure was going too far, too fast. He concluded that only when Britain was seen to abide by the treaties of protection with the hinterland and engage in a determined effort to extend development beyond the confines of Aden could the hybrid that was the Federation have any chance of sustaining itself beyond the imagination of officials in the Colonial Office. For the time being, in the late 1950s, Aden remained a Crown colony and outside the immediate purview of this new structure, but it was clear that the next step planned in London would be for Aden to divest itself of a Crown colony status and to become a state like any other as part of an expanded federation that would also, it was hoped, include the Eastern Protectorates. In this process of controlled liberalisation, however, London alienated the old elite that had hitherto supported British power in Aden, but without ever overseeing the emergence of a new coterie of like-minded individuals willing to play the part of political entrepreneurs in this state-building enterprise. Now, it was hoped that the extension of the franchise would foster acceptance of the planned political order. I would argue this was a noble endeavour, and in more propitious circumstances there was every chance that the net result of this process of constitutional decolonisation, and one that drew on the experience of Cyprus for inspiration, would have been an independent state of South Arabia willing to confer sovereign base rights to the British. But the combination of time, timing, and location proved effective conspirators in undermining such hopes. The success of the oil refinery had led to a vast increase in the population of Aden by the beginning of 1960 as migration followed prosperity. While helping the port to prosper, this new indentured labour lived and worked, for the most part, in appalling conditions. Not surprisingly, a number of labour organisations began to emerge. By 1956, these had coalesced into the Aden Trade Unions Confederation, the ATUC, led by its charismatic Secretary General, Abdullah al-Asnaj. But the pretensions of al-Asnaj went beyond mere labour reform. At a public meeting in Aden on the 10th of February 1960, he was reported to have declared that a nationalist programme will be carried out to strengthen your belief in a united Yemen. One nation, one Yemen, and one struggle only. No north, no south, but one Yemen. No legislative council, no federation. There is only one Yemen, the occupied part of which must be liberated. Now, in terms of territorial sovereignty, the demands of this fiery trade unionist were of a piece with the age-old irredentism espoused by the dynastic order in Sana'a. But the ATUC was no cover for the claims of the Yemen royal family. Indeed, its ideals were based on Nasser's view of a new social order in the Middle East, which increasingly came to regard the dynastic regimes across the Middle East as degenerate, counterfeit creations designed to serve the interests of Britain. By the summer of 1952, the ATUC had spawned a political wing, the People's Socialist Party, designed to impede moves towards integration with the protectorates as much as anything else. Indeed, it was quick to show its true nationalist colours. Within days of the coup d'etat that brought Colonel Abdullah as-Salal to power in Sana'a, several leaders of the PSP made their way to the Yemeni capital to proclaim their loyalty to the new republic and their concomitant gratitude to Nasser. In a matter of weeks, 4 of them had been made ministers in that first Republican government. Now, for Britain, so much that was now to unfold in Aden and Yemen relates directly to the persona of Nasser and the legacy that the Suez Crisis cast over London's ability to protect and safeguard its interests. Undoubtedly, the symbols of British power, if not the actual ability to project that power, were badly tarnished in the aftermath of the Suez debacle, marking as it did the eclipse of British power in the region. More than anything else, Suez disabused policymakers in Whitehall of Britain's ability to act both unilaterally and overtly to secure its interests without the support, or at least the nod, from the United States. Still, the view that Britain no longer had the political will to deploy military force to protect its interests must remain conditional. 2 years after Suez, British and American forces, acting in concert, intervened to secure the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan from elements inspired by, if not beholden to, Nasser. The same year saw the United Kingdom establish Middle East Command in Aden, and with it, the exponential growth in its military facilities. And between 1957 to 59, in the neighbouring Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, British troops were instrumental in suppressing a succession of tribal revolts led by the Imam Ghalib bin Ali and backed by Saudi Arabia. The success of this campaign was, for the most part, and dare I say it, much to Whitehall's relief, conducted well away from the glare of publicity. And finally, the importance of the Aden base was demonstrated in June of 1961 following its extensive use by British forces during Operation Vantage, the British intervention in Kuwait. All this demonstrated that while its imprint was less visible, Britain continued to value solid footholds in the mountains and deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. But the belief remained strong among many in Whitehall, and especially among the more vociferous elements of the Conservative Party, that Nasser, ever the populist, remained the root cause of so much of Britain's troubles in the region, and actively supported a range of surrogate movements who were determined to drive the Britain from Arabia. This antipathy towards the Egyptian president had found collective expression both before and during the crisis of October 1956 in the activities of what Anthony Nutting referred to as the Suez Group. Now, Nutting had in mind Julian Amery and Lieutenant Colonel Billy McLean, Neil Billy McLean in particular. It has often been claimed that the Suez Group, smarting under what they saw as Britain's humiliation over Suez, regarded the issue of Aden as a means to exact revenge. Certainly, statements made by Amery and McLean in Parliament leave little doubt as to the personal animus in which they regarded Nasser. Equally, however, they believed that the future prosperity of Britain as a trading nation, notably its reliance on Middle East oil, was threatened by Nasser's hegemonic ambitions throughout the region. Ambitions, they believed, that served only to strengthen, dare I say it, Moscow's hand. When in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Imamat in Yemen in September of '62, events in Yemen threatened to spill over into Federation territory, the moribund Suez Group transformed itself into the Aden Group. And as such, they acted as a powerful quasi-parliamentary body, not only to undermine moves towards recognition of the new order in Sana'a, a recognition, by the way, advocated most forcefully by the Foreign Office, but as events unfolded, becoming exponents of what might be termed para-diplomacy that at times placed the Foreign Office on the back foot. It was this para-diplomacy and the emergence as a result of a British-led mercenary organisation, largely funded by Saudi Arabia, that contributed so much to Nasser's undoing in the Yemen. But it could do little to shore up Britain's position across the Federation. Once the 1966 Defence White Paper was announced, the die was cast for the Federation to collapse through its own internal contradictions, and an insurgent opposition, notably the NLF, buoyed by the momentum and popular support it now enjoyed across the Federation, stood to gain power. Could it have been different? Well, we'll no doubt have these debates during the course of this conference. But the policy of trying to force the square peg of Aden to fit with the round hole of the Federation can be derided as the great act of colonial self-delusion. But it should not be forgotten that whatever the political animus between the federal potentates and the nationalist leaders, this experiment in state creation may well have succeeded but for the revolution in Yemen in 1962. Moreover, some have argued that the 1966 Defence White Paper saw Britain snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, given the parlous state of the Egyptian army in Yemen at the time. In the end, only perhaps Saudi Arabia and Israel got anything like satisfaction from this conflict. In what eventually became the PDRY, conflict between the NLF and what became known as the Front for the Liberation of South Yemen had already started even before the last British troops had left, and proved, we should remind ourselves, far more bloody and far costly to South Yemenis in the numbers of lives lost. At this juncture, Halliday's analysis of Arabia without sultans appeared to have a compelling determinism, the march of history being on the tide of so-called progressive forces. In October 1967, attempts by the Wilson government to assuage the concerns of the various crucial rulers that the withdrawal from Aden did not presage a wider British withdrawal from the Gulf soon sounded very hollow. On the 16th of January 1968, Wilson announced exactly that in a statement to the Commons on what became known as Black Tuesday. Sir Paul Gore-Booth, Permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office, regarded this as the moment when Britain finally abandoned its claim to really be considered as a world power. And for some, it would be events 4 decades later that finally confirmed it. However, that seemingly irresistible tide of progressive forces that appeared set to overwhelm the dynastic regimes of the Middle East in the late 1960s had, by the mid-1970s, been checked, if not repulsed. While Halliday's class-based analysis of revolutionary forces across Arabia anticipated a political order without sultans, direct British support for and direct involvement with monarchical regimes remained crucial to the creation of the United Arab Emirates as it emerged out of the paternalistic embrace of the trucial states. Nowhere, however, was British involvement more critical than in the Sultanate of Oman. Faced with the ongoing rebellion in its Dhofar region, aided and abetted by the newly independent People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, British involvement was crucial in securing dynastic order whose ultimate security came to rest upon that social contract peculiar to the Middle East, the so-called rentier state. Only now, with that regional order in a vast state of flux, is that contract now facing challenges that might not be so easily satiated by using material largesse, the wealth of these Gulf states, to underpin social change. So where does this now leave us? Well, reflecting on his father's work, Saul Kelly, son of J.B. Kelly, wrote, and I quote, "The British position in Arabia and the Gulf was built up over 150 years. It was liquidated in 6 between 1965 to 1971. Britain simply abandoned their former subjects and protégés to their respective fates and did not really care what followed or made adequate provision for it. It was a catastrophic failure of British foreign policy, yet it was hardly remarked upon at the time or has been since." Well, it may have taken 50 years to do so, but this conference, this meeting today, does indeed now offer a chance to do precisely that, to encourage debate and reasoned argument from the speakers and the audience alike, many of whom here today had intimate experience of some of the issues and events discussed. And, dare I say it, to assess more broadly whether Sir Humphrey Trevelyan's view that Britain left Aden and the Federation without glory but without disaster really had stood the test of time. Thank you very much.